Well, thank you. What a privilege. I know I speak for all of my American colleagues here. What a privilege it is to be here at the RUSI, which we have great admiration for this as an institution to help us think clearly about future war. And obviously, we have tremendous admiration and respect for our British colleagues. And General Nick, it's just a real privilege to be with you and to be with so many of our friends, friendships that have developed over 14 years of conflict and bonds of mutual respect and trust and admiration, I think, that have bound our forces together. And I think bound us together at a really critical time for us now to be able to think about what we've learned from recent armed conflict, what we see going on in the world today, and sir, what a wonderful talk about the problems that you face and that we see in Europe. And I think that the title of this panel was a bit of a setup for me because I tended to try to emphasize continuity as well as change in thinking about future war. And I think that's probably the most important thing for us to do, is to recognize that what we see today is not unprecedented. And in fact, it is when we neglect continuities in the nature of war when we get ourselves into trouble. And in particular, I think it is when we undervalue land forces in particular as part of joint capabilities, and especially land forces that are capable of operating in sufficient scale and for ample duration to accomplish objectives. And I think we're in a period now that is critical in terms of threats to our national security and our international security, but I think it's also a time that's critical because I think we're engaged in self-delusion about future war, and we're building vulnerabilities into our forces as a result of this self-delusion. So first of all, I think, what should we keep in mind in terms of continuities in the nature of war? And these are all going to be quite obvious to this group here. But first is that war is an extension of politics. Russia understands this. Vladimir Putin understands this. And so he is waging really a limited war for limited objectives. He is using a broad range of means to do that, the use of unconventional forces under the cover of significant conventional force capabilities, and a very sophisticated campaign of propaganda, disinformation, political subversion, and so forth, which the general just described to us. So I think when we neglect, though, that war is an extension of politics, we neglect, I think, the importance of land forces operating as part of a joint team to accomplish sustainable political outcomes consistent with our interests. The second key continuity in war is another quite obvious one, is that war is human, and that people are fight today, for the same reasons that Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago. And so this is important because we have to recognize that we have to be able to consolidate gains. We have to be able to operate effectively on this battleground of perception to influence the fears, sense of honor, and interests of parties to a conflict. And I think what a tremendous initiative with 77 Brigade and a recognition that we have to conduct military operations in a way that allows us to consolidate gains among humans that lead to a sustainable political outcome. The third continuity in the nature of war that we neglect, I think, at our own peril is that war is uncertain. And so what we try to do is we try to make some tidy sort of outlines about future war and describe future war mainly as a game of standoff capability and targeting. But of course, our enemies have a say in the future course of events, and our enemies are doing all they can to avoid being classified as a target. And so we have to recognize really this interaction with the enemy countermeasures, and so forth, and I'll talk quickly about that as well. And then the fourth continuity in the nature of war is that war is a contest of wills. And I think General Nick's opening comments are extremely important in that connection. It might be very complicated to describe what we're trying to achieve politically, but all the more important that we do so, right? Because really the test of strategy is, can you explain to your soldiers how the risks that they're taking and the sacrifices they're making are contributing to an outcome that's worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. That is the true test, I think, of strategy. And so what we really need to be able to do is to be able to impose our will through the conduct of military operations and efforts to consolidate gains to get, again, to those sustainable political outcomes. And that's why our Army operating concept is entitled Win in a Complex World. So if we neglect these continuities, what happens? What happens is we buy into fallacies about future war. And these fallacies about future war, I think, have really risen to the degree of conventional wisdom. But what they ought to be challenged, because when you begin to isolate them and look at them, you see that these are really exercises, again, in self-delusion. The first of these I would call it a vampire fallacy because you can't kill it. It comes back every 10 years. And this is the idea that you can solve the complex problem of future war from standoff range, essentially, and from targeting enemy organizations. And this is really, it has its roots back in the 1920s and strategic air power theories, strategic bombing theories. And it comes back every 10 years. And its latest manifestation, it was the early sort of manifestations or ideas around air-sea battle. Previously in the 1990s, it was the orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs and so forth. The second fallacy is related to that, and you might call it a zero dark 30 fallacy. The idea that you can wage war mainly through raiding against networked enemy organizations. A third fallacy, I think, is it's an American old show called the Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom show. And on that show, the host would introduce the topic of the day, some form of wildlife, lions, tigers, crocodiles, and so forth. And Marlon Perkins, the host of the show, though, was not getting down with the lions, tigers, and crocodiles. His assistant, Jim, was. And so under this fallacy, we will be like Marlon Perkins, and we'll just get Jim, other armies, to do our fighting for us. And then the final of these fallacies is I would call it the RSVP fallacy, right? You can just opt out of future war or future land warfare. I'm sorry that the United Kingdom or the United States regrets it is unable to attend your war. Thank you for the kind invitation. And as we see from events in Tunisia, from 7/7, from 9/11, that we ought to be reminded of what Trotsky said, right? You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Or maybe G.K. Chesterton, who said that war may not be the best way of resolving differences, but it may be the only way to ensure they're not resolved for you. So I think that these delusions, though, I think are leading to some flawed assumptions that I'd like to introduce just maybe as some food for thought and maybe further discussion. So what are implicit assumptions about future war that are driving, I think, defense strategies in Western nations? These implicit assumptions, I think, are important for us to expose because what is happening is they are leading to an undervaluing of ready land forces, again, capable of operating in sufficient scale and for ample duration to deter war and to accomplish the mission in future armed conflict. I think that some of these assumptions are the following. First, that joint forces and interorganizational partners can solve complex political military problems from standoff range. Second, that a narrow range of military technologies will be decisive, in future war. That just by investing in this narrow range of technologies, that we will be able to secure our nations against determined and I think increasingly elusive and capable enemies. Another, I think, is that technology can substitute for capacity, especially the size of land forces in particular. And I think if we tend to think linearly about war, I think that we have bottomed out in our ability to trade off technology for manpower. And I think in the future, based on our enemies employing countermeasures, and based on really our ability to operate with freedom of movement and action in the maritime, airspace, and cyberspace domains now increasingly challenged, that I believe that there will be a greater and greater demand for manpower and womanpower, especially in land forces, than there has been in the past. And we can no longer trade off, I believe, technology for manpower. Another assumption, I think, is that partners will be reliable, possessing both the capability and the will to act consistent with U.S., UK, NATO interests. We know that's the case. We could run through a litany of recent experiences in that connection. I think another implicit assumption is that the consolidation of gains is not an inherent aspect of armed conflict. Another may be that ad hoc joint teams can aggregate and disaggregate without losing combat effectiveness. Another may be that a sanitary form of power projection rather than fighting under chaotic and uncertain conditions is what the joint force does to respond to and resolve crises. And I think another may be that deterrence comes from standoff capabilities or the application of overwhelming firepower, think strategic bombing theory, rather than forward deterrence and the ability to deny an enemy even limited objectives. And I think we see this with Russia, right? Russia is a power that is using limited war for limited objectives. and really accomplishing these limited objectives at no cost, because there is no military deterrent capability at the frontier, and then consolidating those gains and portraying the reaction by NATO as escalatory. And so the importance of ready land forces to impose costs on potential enemies and have an important role in deterrence. I think ready land forces, what you may think of it in terms of Raymond Bradbury, when he wrote Fahrenheit 451, he was interviewed shortly after the publication of the novel, and an interviewer said, are you trying to predict the future? And he said, hell no, I'm not trying to predict the future, I'm trying to prevent it. And so, it's by investment in ready land forces that you can maybe help prevent the future. So, okay, how should we think about future war? How should we think about changes in future conflict? I would say 4 factors we have to consider. Threats, enemies, and adversaries in the operating environment. We have to think clearly about real threats. And there are plenty of them out there, right? There are state and non-state threats. We see this with the establishment of a terrorist pseudo-state in the greater Middle East. We see it with Russia, and I think we could argue China, both really using unconventional means under the cover of conventional force capabilities to really change the post-World War II, certainly the post-Cold War, security and political order in the world. And I think a security and political order that has prevented great power conflict for 70 years. I think a good thing that we ought to keep in mind and try to preserve. Our enemies are doing 4 things. They're evading our capabilities. Again, on land, war is different. What complicates war on land? Geography, the presence of non-combatants. The fact that these targets may be tens of thousands of so-called targets, all of whom are trying to avoid being classified as such. And so our enemies will evade our capabilities. Our enemies are now increasingly disrupting our capabilities. We see this in Ukraine. We see this with the ease with which technology and technological capabilities are transferred to our enemies and adversaries. I would say that technology is the element of our differential advantage over our enemies, which is most easily transferred to our enemies. So where does our power come from? Our power comes from combinations of well-trained soldiers and teams with a broad range of technologies that can be combined in joint operations. So our enemies are disrupting what has been our technological differential advantage over the enemy. They are also emulating these capabilities, as I mentioned, and then also they're expanding onto other battlegrounds. So we could talk more about that, and I think this will be a theme through the conference. So threats, enemies, adversaries. The second is missions. What kinds of missions do you have for land forces? I mentioned deterrence, right? And the important role of forward-positioned and rotational ready land forces that can ratchet up the cost at the frontier, for example. But I think also in the future, we're going to have to conduct operations to deny safe havens and support bases to these terrorist organizations, transnational terrorist organizations. And I think that we are now facing a threat of long-range weapon systems, maybe connected to weapons of mass destruction. And what this means is Army forces must operate as part of joint teams in a way that I think is analogous to dealing with the threat of V-1s and V-2s to London in World War II. And this is something I think we ought to think about, expeditionary maneuver, and I'll talk quickly about that. The third factor is technology, understanding really what technologies can give us our differential advantage. And General Richard has said great points about really what technologies hold promise, I think, to improve our capabilities. But we have to recognize what countermeasures are to those technologies, right? The submarine sonar, bomber radar, machine gun tank, anti-tank missile. None of these technologies will appear and give us advantages really without our enemies adopting countermeasures. And the fourth key factor is history and lessons learned. And this is an area that I think we oftentimes neglect, and it gets back to the original point of continuity and change. A great historian named Carl Becker said that the memory of the past and the anticipation of the future should walk hand in hand in a happy way. And I think this is how we have to think about future war. So if those are the 4 factors to consider, what are 4 ideas that our U.S. Army is focused on now? The first is the need to shape security environments, influence key actors in those environments, and consolidate gains. The second is that we have to conduct expeditionary maneuver, and I think this is analogous to your term joint strike. We have to be able to deploy rapidly into unexpected locations, but then we have to be able to transition quickly. And these forces have to have the appropriate combination of mobility, protection, and lethality to accomplish the mission, and they have to be capable of operating, again, at sufficient scale and for ample duration to accomplish the mission. Just getting there quickly is not the objective. It's, and then what must you do? And we have to build these sort of capabilities into our force. This leads into the idea of expeditionary maneuver. Expeditionary mission command is part of this, and we're doing, I think, some good work to avoid, these chateau headquarters and so forth, and to develop, very capable headquarters that are relatively lean and can deploy quickly and transition into operations very quickly. Related to this is an idea of joint combined arms operations, the need for us to elevate our understanding of combined arms to include joint but also multinational partners, interorganizational, the new clunky term that we're using now for civil-military efforts, to be able to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative across multiple battlegrounds. The physical battleground, the battleground of perception and information, the battleground of political subversion, for example, and criminality. And so this is an important concept for us. It gets to really your term that you're using, integrated operations, is a central part of it. The fourth key thing that we're doing is trying to innovate quickly, which we're saying is to really turn ideas into valued outcomes, and to do that faster than determined enemies can do them. And so we could talk more about that, how we're doing it. I'm excited about really this time for our Army because, as I mentioned, the stakes are high, and we're up against really very determined and capable enemies, and we're up against these delusions, the self-delusion about future war. And so I think that it's all the more important that we think clearly about future war, and that we develop concepts that are sound, that are balanced in terms of understanding of continuity and change, continuity in the nature of war, change in the character of armed conflict, and that we also, though, understand how to get from those concepts to future force capabilities. And so I would just invite you to please read the Army Operating Concept. It's a page turner. It's beach reading for you for the summer, and Annex B describes how we go from concepts to capabilities, and we've changed in a fundamental way the way we do that, and instead of working by warfighting functions, intelligence, maneuver, sustainment, categories that artificially separate those things which have to be routinely combined in operations, we have now established a framework of the warfighting challenges. 20 first-order questions, the answers to which will improve current and future force combat effectiveness. And those are also, just if you Google Army Warfighting Challenges, I invite you to that website. And thank you so much, and thank you for the privilege of being with you.